Edmund Hale woke, as he always did, to the gray light that came before the dawn. For 6 years, this had been the color of his world. The space beside him in the bed was not empty. It was full of a cold and settled absence. He did not reach for it anymore. He had learned, with the same slow and stubborn competence he had once applied to tracking a man across 3 counties, how to sleep alone, how to wake alone, how to fill the hours of a day that held no promise of anything new. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet finding the cold floorboards without a sound. The house was a creature of his own habits now, its creaks and groans as familiar to him as the lines on his own hands. He dressed in the dark, denim trousers, a flannel shirt, socks worn thin at the heel. He moved through the small rooms of the house he had built with his own 2 hands, the house where he had loved a woman named Mary, where he had raised 2 sons, where he was now waiting out the remainder of his time. Competent at solitude. That was what he had become. In the kitchen, he ground the coffee beans himself, the rhythmic crunching a small rebellion against the silence. He boiled water on the cast-iron stove, his movements economical and practiced. He had learned to cook, to mend his own clothes, to keep a house in order. He had learned that work was a balm for a mind that threatened to wander into landscapes of memory from which it was difficult to return. The tasks were solid, real. The grief was not. It was a fog, a mist, something you could not get your hands on. So he focused on the things he could hold: an axe handle, a sack of flour, a cup of hot coffee. He took his cup to the front window, which looked out onto the main street of Crestfall, Wyoming. It was April, and the mud of the thaw was giving way to the promise of dust. The town was built of timber and stone and stubbornness, huddled against the vast, indifferent sweep of the plains and the sharp rise of the mountains beyond. Across the street, the general store was still dark. Next door, the building that had once been a surveyor's office had stood vacant for 2 years, its windows like clouded, unseeing eyes. He had grown accustomed to its emptiness. It was a reflection of his own. Then he saw it. A light. A soft, yellow glow bloomed in the downstairs window of the vacant building. It was a lamp, tentative and warm against the retreating dark. Edmund stood perfectly still, his coffee forgotten in his hand. He watched as a shadow moved behind the glass, a human shape, deliberate and unhurried. For the first time in 6 years, something was different. The day had brought something new. He did not know if he liked it. Later that morning, after the sun had burned the last of the chill from the air, a wagon pulled up in front of the building. Edmund watched from his porch, feigning interest in a piece of harness leather he was mending. He saw a woman directing the placement of crates and barrels. She was not young, but she was not old either. Her hair, pulled back in a simple knot, was a mix of brown and silver that caught the sun. She moved with an efficiency that spoke of a life spent doing, not talking about doing. He watched her tack a freshly painted sign to the post beside the door. The letters were neat, graceful. Clara's Flowers. Edmund lowered the piece of leather. Flowers. In Crestfall, a town where the most common plant was sagebrush and the most common smell was horse and coal smoke. It seemed a foolish, hopeful sort of venture, a fragile business for a hard place. He thought of Mary, who had loved the wild lupine that grew in the foothills, who would have been delighted. The thought was a sudden sharp ache, an old wound probed. He set his jaw and went back to his work, the rhythmic pull of the awl and thread of familiar comfort. He would not think about it. He would not think about her. Clara Marsh felt the man's eyes on her as she worked. She did not look over. She had learned in the 3 years since her husband, Daniel, had been laid to rest that the world was full of watchers. Most were curious, some were pitying, a few were predatory. She had learned to distinguish between them by the weight of their gaze. This one was different. It was heavy, but not menacing. It was still, like a mountain. She had spent her grief learning what came next. For a year she had done nothing but exist within the four walls of the house they had shared, the silence, a constant, screaming companion. Then, one day, she had gone out to the garden Daniel had planted for her and found it choked with weeds. She had spent the entire day on her knees, pulling and digging, her hands raw, her back aching. And at the end of it, with the soil cleared and the surviving rose bushes pruned, she had felt a flicker of something that was not sorrow. It was purpose. So she learned. She read books on botany. She traded letters with a cousin who kept a nursery in Ohio. She turned her small garden into a riot of color and life. She learned what thrived in the harsh Wyoming soil and what withered. She learned that beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity. A town like Crestfall needed it. She needed it. And so Clara's Flowers was born not of a whim, but of a quiet, fierce determination to make something grow in the barren ground of loss. The building smelled of dust and disuse, but it was solid. The light was good. She swept the floors, her movements brisk, scattering the ghosts of the surveyor and his forgotten maps. This would be a place of life. She would make it so. A week later, the shop was ordered. Buckets of lilacs and early wild roses filled the air with a scent so alien to Crestfall's main street that people slowed as they passed, their expressions a mixture of confusion and pleasure. Clara had set up a sturdy wooden counter and a small stool for customers, though none had yet come in. She was arranging a bucket of tall, proud delphiniums when a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up. It was the man from next door, the retired sheriff, Edmund Hale. She knew who he was. In a town this size, you knew everyone's story, or at least the public chapters of it. He was a widower, a quiet man. He stood in the entrance, large and solid, holding a small glass jar in one hand. He seemed uncertain, as if he had walked to her door and only just now considered what he would do when he arrived. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting. "Mr. Hale," she replied, her tone even. She kept her hands busy with the flowers. He took a step inside, holding out the jar. It was full of a deep, amber-colored honey. "From the Miller farm," he said. "Last of it. They sold up and moved on last year. Thought you might. A welcome." The words came out as if they were unfamiliar in his mouth. A pause. It was a gesture of profound thoughtfulness. The Miller honey was legendary in Crestfall, and its absence was felt. To part with the last of it was no small thing. She dried her hands on her apron and took the jar from him. His fingers were calloused and warm. "That is a very kind welcome, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice softer than before. "Thank you." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the set of a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. She saw a loneliness that mirrored her own, but of a different shape. Hers was a house with open windows, letting in the light. His was a house with the shutters bolted fast. She gestured with her chin toward the stool. "Sit a moment. If you have one." He hesitated, then gave a short, sharp nod and sat. He looked out of place among the buckets of bright blossoms, a figure of granite in a field of wildflowers. He did not speak. He watched her work, his gaze steady. Clara did not feel the need to fill the silence. She understood it. It was the quiet of two people who had already said all the most important words to someone else and had none left over for trivialities. He never quite stopped coming back. It became a ritual, unspoken and unplotted. Each morning he would appear in her doorway, his own tin cup in hand. She would pour him a measure of coffee from the pot she kept warm on the small stove in the back room. He would sit on the stool, and she would work, and the silence would stretch between them, comfortable now, companionable. Sometimes they talked. The talk was of practical things. The weather, the strange blight affecting the cottonwoods down by the creek, the price of lumber. He told her, in a few spare sentences, that the east-facing wall of her shop would take the worst of the winter wind, and that she should have it insulated before the first snow. She thanked him. He told her which of the ranchers were reliable about paying their debts and which were not. She filed the information away. One day, he looked at a cluster of pale yellow roses. "Mary liked yellow," he said, his voice flat. It was the first time he had said his wife's name. Clara paused, a stem of fern in her hand. "Daniel was partial to irises," she replied, her voice just as steady. "He said they looked like soldiers standing at attention." And that was all. A simple trading of facts, of ghosts. But the foundation between them settled a little deeper, became a little more solid. They were two people who had learned the specific honesty of those who have already lost what they loved most. There were no pretenses left. Edmund found that the shape of his days had changed. They were no longer a flat, unbroken plain to be crossed. Now there was a landmark, a small, warm space that smelled of damp earth and living things, a woman with a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a quiet strength in her eyes. He began to notice the light, the way it fell across the floor of her shop in the late afternoon, the way it caught the silver in her hair. The house was emptier when he returned to it. The silence he had mastered had become, once again, just loneliness. He did not name the feeling that was growing in him. It was a seed planted in long, fallow ground, and he was content to simply feel its slow, unfamiliar stirring. He had not expected to feel anything again. It was enough. Then Thomas came to visit. Clara's son was a man from a different world. He arrived on the train from Cheyenne, dressed in a city suit, his shoes polished to a high shine. He was sharp and quick, his mind full of ledgers and contracts. He loved his mother, and his love was a fiercely protective thing. He saw the small town, the dusty street, the foolish flower shop, and he saw a dozen ways she could be hurt. He found Edmund sitting on the stool in his mother's shop, sipping his morning coffee. Thomas's eyes, as sharp as his suit, took in the scene. The quiet old man, the comfortable silence, his mother's easy presence. And he grew suspicious. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice polite but with an edge of steel. "My mother tells me you were the sheriff here for many years." "A long time," Edmund agreed. He met the younger man's gaze and held it. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of men defending their claim, their family, their honor. He was not offended. A man in that position sees a great deal of the harder side of life, Thomas continued, his meaning clear. "He does," Edmund said. "My mother is a trusting woman," Thomas said, dropping the pretense. "She sees the good in people." "A rare quality," Edmund observed, his tone dry. "And a valuable one." The conversation was a duel fought with pleasantries. Thomas worried about his mother's heart, but also her savings. He saw a lonely old man looking for a nurse and a purse. Edmund saw a son who loved his mother and was blind to the fact that she was more than capable of navigating her own life. The tension was a new element in the quiet shop, a discordant note in a simple melody. A week after Thomas's arrival, another stranger came to Crestfall. This one did not arrive on the train, but in a smart, well-sprung buggy pulled by a handsome bay. He called himself Mr. Reed, and he was a man made of smiles and smooth words. He said he represented the Western Progressive Development Company, a name that sounded important and vague in equal measure. He talked of progress, of a railroad spur that was being surveyed, of the prosperity that was just around the corner for a town like Crestfall. He walked the main street, admiring the buildings, his eyes lingering on the older, less prosperous ones. His gaze fell upon Clara's flowers. Edmund watched him from his window. He had seen men like Reed before. They were a different breed from the outlaws and rustlers he had spent his life chasing. They did not carry guns. They carried portfolios of official-looking documents. Their weapon was the law itself, twisted and used against the very people it was meant to protect. Reed's smile did not reach his eyes. His posture was too relaxed, his confidence a performance. Edmund's old instincts, long dormant, began to stir. Reed entered the flower shop, his hat in his hand, his smile wide and reassuring. He praised the flowers, praised Clara's industry and vision. Then he laid his proposal on the counter. His company, he explained, was acquiring properties along the street to build a new modern hotel, a testament to Crestfall's bright future. He was prepared to offer her a generous price for her building, a price that would give her security, a comfortable retirement. Crescent, her heart aflutter with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The sum he named was more than she had dared to dream of. It would mean she would not have to worry. It would appease Thomas, who was so concerned for her welfare. The papers Reed showed her were dense with legal language, but it all seemed above board. Edmund, sitting in his usual spot, said nothing. He watched Reed's hands. He watched his eyes. He listened to the cadence of his speech. And he remembered. A case from 20 years ago. A smooth-talking man representing a phantom mining concern. He had used deeds with clouded titles and obscure territorial statutes on mineral rights to swindle 3 families out of their ranches. The scheme was identical in its bones. The use of a future promise, a railroad, a mine to justify a present-day transaction full of hidden clauses. Reed was not buying her land. He was planning to steal it, using a flaw in the original survey to claim the title was invalid once she signed away her rights for a pittance. That evening, Edmund went to the saloon. Not to drink, but to listen. He stood at the bar, nursing a single whiskey, and heard Reed holding court, buying drinks, spinning his tales of progress. The talk was all of the railroad spur. But Edmund knew the Union Pacific had no plans for a spur line near Crestfall. He had spoken to a survey chief himself just last year about a water rights issue. Reed was building his con on a foundation of pure air. His certainty hardened into a cold, heavy stone in his gut. He walked home under a sky full of indifferent stars. Through her window he could see Clara at her small desk, the papers spread out before her, a pen in her hand. He saw the worry and the hope warring in her posture. He saw her vulnerability, and a feeling rose in him so fierce and protective it took his breath away. It was not the abstract duty of a lawman protecting a citizen. It was personal. This was Clara. The quiet of his own house was unbearable. The order he had created, the solitude he had mastered, it all felt like a prison. He had retired from the world, from its dangers and its passions. He had believed he was finished with it all. He had been wrong. He went to the tall wooden wardrobe in his bedroom. In the bottom, beneath a stack of old blankets, was a small, locked chest. He had not opened it in 6 years. The key was in a tin box on his mantelpiece. His fingers trembled slightly as he fitted it into the lock. The chest opened with a small sigh of wood and memory. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was his service revolver, cleaned and oiled. And beside it, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, was his badge. A simple, 5-pointed star of tarnished silver. Sheriff, Laramie County. He had put it away on the day he buried Mary, swearing he was done. Done with the violence, the ugliness, the endless, wearying fight. The badge was a symbol of a life he had left behind. A life of duty. He picked it up. The weight of it in his palm was familiar, solid. A lifetime of authority and responsibility concentrated in one small piece of metal. But as he stood there, the metal warming to his touch, he knew he was not picking it up for duty. He was not picking it up for the law or for the town of Crestfall. He was picking it up for the woman next door who smelled of earth and roses and had lit a lamp in his darkness. Some things, he thought, were worth picking back up. The next morning he did not take his coffee cup. He walked out his front door and straight to hers. He did not knock. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. Reed was there, standing over Clara's shoulder, a pen extended in his hand. "It's a simple formality, my dear lady," he was saying, his voice a silken purr. "Just your signature, and your future is secure." Clara looked up as Edmund entered. Her face was pale, her eyes uncertain. Thomas stood near the back, his arms crossed, his expression a mask of doubt. He did not trust Reed, but he did not know why. Edmund ignored them all. He walked directly to the counter and, without a word, placed the silver star between Reed's hand and the contract. The air in the small shop went still and silent. Reed froze. He stared at the badge as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. It was tarnished, old, but its meaning was unmistakable. He slowly looked up, his smile gone, his eyes finally showing a flicker of genuine emotion. "Fear." "Mr. Reed," Edmund said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room. It was the voice he had used 100 times to face down men with guns and knives and hatred in their hearts. Quiet, final. "I was sheriff in this county for 32 years. I've seen every kind of man and every kind of lie, and I know your kind." Reed began to bluster. "I don't know what you mean. This is a legitimate business transaction." "Is it?" Edmund interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. "Does it mention the territorial statute of 1869 regarding fraudulent conveyance? Or the precedent set in Aberdeen Land versus Parker, which found that any contract predicated on a deliberately misrepresented future event is null and void? I remember that case. I testified at the trial. The man looked a lot like you. He's been breaking rocks at the territorial prison for 20 years now." He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply laid out the facts, the cold, hard language of the law that Reed had sought to twist for his own purposes. He spoke of survey lines and title chains and the specific legal definition of fraud. It was a masterful, brutal dissection of Reed's entire scheme. Reed's face, which had been florid, went slack and pale. He saw not just an old man. He saw the institution of the law made flesh. He saw the decades of experience, the unshakable certainty. He was caught, and he knew it. "I think," Edmund said, his gaze like chips of ice, "that you have business elsewhere." For a long moment, Reed did not move. Then, with a jerky, defeated motion, he snatched his hat from the counter, and without a word to Clara, turned and fled the shop. The bell chimed his retreat. The silence he left behind was profound. The silver badge lay on the wooden counter, catching a sunbeam. Clara stared at it, then slowly raised her eyes to Edmund's face. She saw the cost of what he had just done. The dredging up of a past he had buried, the shouldering of a burden he had laid down. He had stepped back into the world for her. Thomas, her son, finally uncrossed his arms. He looked from the empty doorway to the badge, and then to Edmund. The suspicion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep and dawning respect. He had seen a protector, not a predator. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," he said, the words quiet but sincere. Edmund gave a slight nod in his direction, but his eyes were on Clara. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," he said, his voice returning to its normal, quiet rumble. "I did." In that single word was a declaration more powerful than any poem. It was an admission, a promise, a statement of fact. "I did this for you. Because you are important. Because this matters." She reached out and her fingers brushed against the back of his hand where it rested on the counter. A small, fleeting touch that was an answer. "I know." The seasons turned. Thomas returned to Cheyenne, his mind at ease. The town of Crestfall, having heard the story in a dozen different versions, settled into a collective, satisfied consensus. It made sense. Edmund Hale and Clara Marsh. They were two solid, respectable people who had earned a measure of peace. The morning coffees continued, but the space between them had changed. The silence was no longer just companionable, it was intimate. They began to share meals at the small table in her back room. On Sundays, he would walk with her to the small white church at the end of town, his stride slow to match hers. The courtship was as quiet and steady as they were. It was a thing of shared tasks and comfortable silences, of small kindnesses and unspoken understanding. He would repair a broken window latch for her. She would leave a plate of warm stew on his porch. One evening in late summer, they sat on the bench outside her shop, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, painting the clouds in shades of rose and violet. The air was warm and smelled of dust and the sweet peas climbing the trellis beside them. He turned to her. He had been thinking about it for weeks, turning the words over in his mind until they were smooth and plain and true. "Clara," he said. She waited, her hands resting in her lap. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. "I have been a solitary man for a long time," he began, his gaze fixed on the darkening mountains. "I thought that was the end of my story. But this house, my house, it is too quiet now. It requires a different kind of life inside it." He paused, then looked at her directly. "I would like to stay, Clara. Not just for coffee. I would like to stay as your husband." She looked at his earnest, weathered face, at the eyes that had seen so much and were now fixed only on her. A slow smile, the first he had ever truly seen, spread across her face. "It was a lovely thing. It took you long enough, Edmund," she said softly. The wedding was in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek were a blaze of gold. It was a small affair. The church was filled not with strangers, but with the familiar faces of the town. Clara wore a simple dress of deep blue and carried a bouquet of late-blooming roses and asters from her own shop. Edmund stood beside her, straight and tall in his best suit, his hand steady as he placed a simple gold band on her finger. The town looked on and saw not an ending, but a beginning. It felt right. It felt settled. 5 years passed. The world turned, and Crestfall grew a little, but not too much. The flower shop thrived, now run by a young woman whom Clara had trained, a girl with a good eye for color and a strong back. But Clara still kept her hand in, growing the more delicate hybrids in a new greenhouse Edmund had built for her behind their house. It was a warm evening in June. Edmund sat on the porch swing of the house that was no longer just his, but theirs. The wood was smooth under his hand. He was carving a small wooden horse for their eldest grandchild, a boy with Clara's thoughtful eyes and his own stubborn chin. The shavings fell in fragrant curls around his boots. Clara came out, carrying 2 cups. She handed one to him. The coffee was hot and strong, just as he liked it. She sat beside him, the swing moving in a slow, gentle rhythm. The porch was covered in climbing roses now, their scent heavy in the evening air. She watched his gnarled fingers move with surprising delicacy, the knife shaping the soft pine. "You're still slow with your hands," she said, her voice full of fond amusement. It was an old joke between them now. He looked up from his work, not at the horse, but at her face, softened by the twilight. He reached out and tucked a stray wisp of silver hair behind her ear. His touch was as gentle as it was sure. "Some things," he said, his voice a low, contented murmur, "are worth taking your time over." Her hand came to rest on his, and they sat together in the gathering dark, the silence full and warm and complete. They were home. It was a life built not on grand passion, but on 1,000 small, sturdy moments. A jar of honey, a silver badge on a countertop, a shared cup of coffee in the morning light. It was a love that had come late, but it had come to stay. That is the thing about the quiet heart. It does not advertise its contents. It holds its treasures in the deep, silent places, waiting for the one person patient enough to learn its language. Love is not always a wildfire, a consuming blaze that remakes the landscape. Sometimes it is a lamp lit in a dark window, a steady, unwavering flame promising warmth against the cold. It is a presence, a quiet understanding, a hand reaching out not in passion but in simple, profound companionship. It is the courage to pick up a burden you thought you had laid down forever, not for duty, but for devotion.